For persons who may have heard me present before, I share very openly that I'm originally from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. And for those of you who know Trinis, we are very passionate people. And this is an area that I'm quite passionate about, so that if I speak too quickly, please just raise your hand, let me know. I'll ignore you anyway, but at least I know you would have raised your hand and you're listening to me. Okay, so good morning again. It's really a pleasure for me to be able to present to you at my first international forum here with Quigger. I joined the Quigger team in January this year. And just to let you know that this project that I'm speaking about is a 3-year project. So for those of you like Stephen who said they're mathematicians, so to speak, you'll see there's a difference between the 3-year project and the 6 months that I've been here. So if there are any historical questions, thankfully Melissa's in the room and Leanne is in and out as well. So this particular project, I have to acknowledge Scotiabank, who funded or who is funding the 3-year project. And members of the Scotiabank team were Diana Matsenki, Sujay Vardem, Carla Boos. We also have to acknowledge the Episodic Disabilities Advisory Committee as well. Some of you may be on that committee as well. And the consultants, Chronicle Analytics, who did the research and put together the document. So just a bit about the 3-year project. In 2011, Quigger undertook in partnership or with support of Scotiabank research to better understand the complex barriers to employment participation and the types of initiatives that might address these barriers. And the result of that is a publication that many of you may have referred to. If not, I would recommend that you do refer to as Evolving the Workplace. And one of the recommendations coming out of that was answering the question, why should employers hire a person with an episodic disability? So that was 2011. In 2012, the draft business case was developed, and this is what I'm actually going to present on now. And this year, which is the 3rd year of the project, we're finalizing the business case and developing templates for accommodation plans or plan for employees living with episodic disabilities. So the purpose of the research, of course, which I mentioned earlier on. Also, I'm sorry. The presentation overview is actually the purpose of the research, the context of the research, work impacts of episodic disabilities, the economic argument itself as developed through that research, some of the conclusions and the recommendations. So the purpose of the research, as I shared just a few seconds ago, there was a critical gap that was identified in terms of going to employers and saying, you should hire, you should retain people with episodic disabilities. And of course, for employers, they look at the bottom line. They look at what's in it for me. And that was a gap. So the research also examined the factors that impact on decisions to hire, accommodate workers with episodic disabilities. And the attempt was to articulate the economic argument, and that is to fill the gap. So what's in it for the company as well as the people living with episodic disabilities? So I'm just going to share the context of the research for the Canadians in the room who may be aware, and for those of you from Ireland, England, and the US. The average employment rate for persons with disabilities in Canada is 8%, while the national average is around 6%. Disability increases with age, and we've discussed it at length, for example, yesterday. And we're all aware that Canada and many of the other countries have aging populations. So it is estimated, for example, that 20% of Canadians will experience an episode of mental illness in their lifetime. And Canada has one of the highest rates of multiple sclerosis in the world. The range in terms of people living with HIV in Canada is roughly between 55 to 75,000. So we're looking at considerable numbers if we look at all of the categories of illness captured in episodic disabilities. So it begs the question, why do businesses, or why should we encourage businesses to employ people living with disabilities? And you'll hear me refer to disabilities very often because the literature used by the researchers and the team, the consultants, to develop the economic framework, because unfortunately we did not have enough information to develop a framework for episodic disabilities specifically. The literature itself refers to disabilities. So again, if you hear me refer to disabilities, it is because the literature itself is speaking of disabilities. And the aim is, as was the purpose of this research project, to develop specific work on episodic disabilities. So, as adapted by Peck and Kirkbride in their article, Why Hire, that's not the title, I'm paraphrasing, Why Hire People Living with Disabilities. So some of the reasons are some of the barriers related to hiring people with with disabilities, the costs associated with hiring persons with disabilities, the additional supervision or the perceived additional supervision and the loss of productivity, the fear of being, and this is quote, stuck forever with this person, the fear of damaged goods, so that is that the person would not live up to the demands of the job. So again, these are some of the barriers related. In evolving the workplace, a few specific barriers in terms of episodic disabilities were identified. Higher benefits and insurance payments, different planning that may be taken into consideration for unpredictable absences. And often colleagues may resent the accommodation that's put in place for people living with episodic disabilities, especially if they're not aware. And of course, confidentiality issues may dictate that that information is not shared. So those are some of the barriers. But what are the reasons to hire and retain people with episodic disabilities? People with disabilities represent an underutilized labor pool. But some of the reasons identified in the literature to retain them are loyalty to their organizations. Research has shown that people with disabilities are some of the most loyal employees. Supports developed for persons with disabilities really benefit the organization as a whole, as the culture of accommodation put in place in the workplace benefits everyone. And the capital investment in a person with a disability, because very often people with disabilities, and here specifically episodic disabilities, are already in their prime and in the workplace. So that investment in the person that you've trained, in the person who has that institutional knowledge is key. What are some of the work impacts of episodic disabilities? And again, we're looking here, the literature that was used for the research speaks to disabilities specifically, unemployed, unplanned work absences, additional stress, fatigue, weakness, gross motor impairment, decreased cognitive abilities. But what are some of the accommodations? And this is the part that's critical for people living with episodic disabilities. Flexible work schedules, working from home, ergonomic supports. And we're talking about ergonomic supports, but some of the other supports put in place, for example, for someone living with Crohn's and colitis maybe just putting the person near to the washroom, accessible rest areas, a self-paced workload. So with all of this in mind, what was the economic argument put forward out of the research? So again, just emphasizing that the methodology was that thorough literature review of existing studies and research on the benefits of hiring and retaining people with disabilities, because it did not exist for episodic disabilities. It was interesting to note, however, that while there have been works published about the benefits of hiring and retaining people with disabilities, from the standpoint of employees, and the government, there was no research that was found from the standpoint of employers. So there was research from the standpoint of employees, of the government, but not employers. So the economic argument had 4 components, and you have them before you: measurable direct benefits, the cost of accommodation, avoidance of legislative and regulatory penalties, and indirect benefits. So there was a more or less an equation developed, and the return was the direct benefit minus the cost of accommodation plus avoidance of legislative and regulatory penalties plus the indirect benefits. So what are some of the conclusions? Significant positive returns with accommodations. Again, going back to the loyalty, the retention of the highly skilled persons who, again, at the prime age, who are in the workforce, who tend to have the expertise, the institutional knowledge. The benefits that are worth the investment, the return on retention, and what they found is that it increases with the salary and responsibility levels, and leveraging employee loyalty. So what are some of the recommendations? Firstly, more in-depth economic research. Because what was developed within the business case was 4 scenarios looking at, for example, a manager living with HIV versus an administrative assistant living with multiple sclerosis, and a tax accountant living with arthritis. So scenarios and costs were associated to each of the components that I referred to. So the accommodation, the avoidance of penalties, and the indirect benefits. However, the average number and duration of episodes needs to be looked at more closely, and the average tenure of employment. Another area that was clearly identified in the research was that even within an organization, depending on the task, again, going back to the administrative assistant versus an employee in a manufacturing assembly line, how are you measuring productivity? The administrative assistant can virtually work from home, whereas the employee who works in a manufacturing assembly line can't work from home. So how are you measuring that? So that is why the business case still needs to be finalized and strengthened, and we are focusing on that during the course of this year. We are looking forward to, for example, support from, I think it's Stephen or any other expertise in the room in economics, in mathematics, who can apply the hardcore economic analysis which needs to strengthen and finalize the business case. Thank you.